Good morning. 3 minutes late. Glad to see everybody here this morning. We're studying in 2 Peter, the second chapter, and we're going to start today with verse 3. If you'll remember last week, we finished up chapter 1 and we got into the beginnings of chapter 2. Of course, in chapter 2 here, Peter is giving a dissertation on the problems with false teachers. And we're going to kind of continue in that happy vein today as we continue our study. And like we kind of said last week, false teachers are something we always have to be on the lookout for, because they can destroy a congregation pretty quick, and more importantly than that, they can destroy people's souls by teaching false things. So before we go any further, I'd like for Pete, if he would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the good day that you've given us, for the opportunity we have to be here this morning. We ask you, Father, to be with David as he leads our minds. Help us to think on the things that he teaches us and help us to apply them to our lives. Be with the other teachers and the classes as they meet as well. These things we ask in your Son's name. Amen.
Okay, so let's look at verse 3. In covetousness shall they with framed words make merchandise of you, whose sentence now from the old lingereth not, and their destruction slumbereth not. So we see here that the first thing he talks about is covetousness. And this is an unlawful desire for personal gain. So the motive here for these false teachers was to get personal gain, and put themselves on a pedestal, and in some cases try to drag the Christians back into some of the things that were under the old law. They just couldn't really get past that. So that was that personal gain was their motivation. And what they did is they used feigned words. They used words they artfully and skillfully put their sentences together and said just enough of what they needed to say to deceive the people who were going to hear. They gave just enough truth to make it sound right, but when you really looked at what they said, it was false, and it was easy to be deceived. And like we talked about last week, these people did not have the advantage of having the whole Bible put together for them that they could sit and read and follow along like we can today, and this was a real problem. So what these teachers were actually doing here, it says they were making merchandise or out of the people. They were duping these people, and they were treating them pretty much like merchandise, as objects which they could use to enhance their own wealth and standing, and they were profiting from this, and this promise was more of not worrying about their salvation, but the motive was more of greed and things along that line. Now Timothy or Paul also talked about this same problem in 1 Timothy 6 and 5 and Titus 1 and 11. And if we look at Titus 1, starting with verse 10, it says, "For there are many unruly men, vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, men who overthrow whole houses, teaching things which they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake." So this was not only a problem in the sphere that Peter was dealing in, but it was also a problem in the sphere that Paul went in. Of course, Paul was pretty much through the known world at that time, and he was seeing this as a real problem. And he pointed out, and Peter infers that one of the problems here is the Jewish converts, that they just couldn't quite get past the things of the old law, and they were trying to force these things of the old law onto the new converts, and the Gentiles, who really didn't know any better. They didn't have the religious background that that the Jews did. They had worshipped a lot of false gods and things along that line, and a lot of these Jews, they were pretty slick talkers. In Philippians 3:19 it says, being evildoers and therefore under the ban of all who disobey God, their destiny was definite and their damnation sure. So again, Paul here was paralleling the things that that Peter was saying. And in Philippians 3:18 and 19 it says, for many walk, of whom I told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, those whose end is perdition, whose God is the belly, and whose glory is their shame, who mind earthly things. So this is the same type of people that Peter is talking about here, and he assures his readers that this is not the damnation and the condemnation is not going to be delayed, and it's not going to be forgotten. He says here, it lingereth not. It's not going to be idle. It's not going to sleep. It's not going to nod. The word that's used here in the original Greek means does not nod. So this is kind of signifying here that these deceivers and all whom they deceive, they're hastening their way toward a bad judgment, and their destiny is coming quickly, and it's not going to be forgotten. God is not going to forget this transgression that's going on here, and it's going to quickly lead them into this damnation. So the proof of this position that he's making here, in the next few verses, Peter is going to cite some well-known instances of problems that false teachers and they're going to lead to destruction. And these three things that Peter's going to talk about in these next few verses, these are things especially to the Jews that they were very familiar with, and in each case, there was a destruction that was not going to be withheld. So let's see any comments about that verse. All right, let's move on to verse 4 then. It says, for if God spareth not angels when they sin, but cast them down to hell, and committed them to the pits of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. So here the angels is the reference that Peter is using. And of course the angels are created beings, and they were set forth for the service that God would have them to do, and not necessarily for the situation of inheriting salvation. They were already pretty much in heaven. If they kept their nose clean, they would be in good shape. But they were some type of mortal creature, and they were answerable to God for their conduct, just like we are today. We're answerable to God for our conduct. But apparently somewhere here along the line, they did something that was outside of their purview, and it was a problem that God had with them, and they were not spared for the sin that they committed. So despite being angels in heaven and having this honorable position that they occupied, the holiness that they possessed was created. When they were created, they sinned, and even the angels in heaven were not spared. Now, it's not revealed to us what the nature of this sin was, but whatever it was bad enough for them to be sent into destruction. And it also doesn't give a number of the ones that were that this happened to. But the thing about it was, even if it was just one, it was going to be a bad situation. Now there's some that hold the view that Satan was a created angel that led a revolt in heaven, and they use Revelations 12:7 as the basis for this theory. And the occasion of the revolt was the spiritual pride and the desire for a higher position that Satan wanted. And this is reference to 1 Timothy 1, 3, and 6. And, for such arrogance and presumption, he was pretty much cast out of heaven. So, obviously we know the devil is still working today, and I guess he's a little upset, so he's trying to work on us today to put us in the same position that he is in. And of course, when we studied the Revelation, we talked about what the ultimate destiny of the devil's going to be. He's going to be in probably the hottest place in hell. So, this is something that the Jews at that time would, be able to relate to. Comments about that verse. All right, let's move on to verse 5. And spareth not the ancient world, but preserved Noah with 7 others, a preacher of righteousness, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. So here the apostle offers a second illustration for the certainty of the judgment that's going to be taken upon the wicked. And he talks here about the ancient world, and it embraced the people who lived before the flood. So he's talking about the flood, and this is something obviously that that the people of that time, especially the Jews, understood. And I think it's kind of interesting to note, there's a lot of people that say, well, the flood really didn't happen. But if you read about a lot of ancient religions and a lot of things that happened in the ancient world, there were a lot of people that in their religion, even though it was a false religion, they talked about a flood. And I mean, when you read about some of these other things, this is something actually, there's too much evidence out there that this flood, did actually happen. So that though these people had a clear and unmistakable warning of impending doom, Noah, told them and warned them for years that this was going to happen, and they just kind of scoffed at him and said, that guy over there's a nut. And, they wouldn't listen to the things that Noah said. And, God gave them plenty of time. I mean, Noah didn't build the ark in a day or two. He had a lot of time to do this. And, the entire time that he was doing this, he was warning the people that this flood was going to happen, and gave them ample time and ample opportunity to change their ways and avoid the destruction, but they didn't. So God showed them his power, and of course he spared Noah and his family. So only Noah and his family, which was his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, were saved. We can read this in Genesis, the 7th chapter, and Peter also in the next chapter talks about this a little bit too. Of course, the account of the flood was in Genesis 6 and 13 through 8 and 19. So Noah here was called a preacher of righteousness in Psalms 119 and 172, and from the fact that he both preached and he practiced righteousness. So Noah was a righteous man, and in his generation, he was an example of as perfect as a man can be. And of course, in Genesis 6 and 9, he talked about Noah walking with God. So he was a preacher, and the word that was used in the original text was the word that meant that he was a herald of righteousness. He was out there proclaiming righteousness, and he denounced the unrighteousness and the corruption that was all around him, and he exhorted all these people to repent and turn unto God. Obviously, they didn't do that. Now, Josephus, of course, was a Jewish historian of the 1st century, and he has a testimony about Noah. He said, Noah, being grieved at the things which were done by them and being displeasured at their counsel, urged them to change for the better their thoughts and their actions. So, here's some historical proof of the things that Noah said. Of course, we know that Josephus was actually a Jew and was probably well versed in the things of the ancient scripture. But seeing that they did not yield, but were mightily mastered by the pleasure of evil, fearing lest they should kill him, he departed from the land with his wife and his sons and the women who they had married. That's in Antiquities 1, 3, and 1 of Josephus's writings. Comments about that verse?
You know, it's been said that during that 100 or 120 years that he preached, we don't know if there was anybody converted during that 100 years that died before the flood.
Right.
So he could have, you know, him being a preacher of righteousness, he could have, you know, been an influence on several people
Right.
that we don't have a record.
Right.
Besides the 8 that were saved.
Well, but and the thing about it was he was steadfast in what he did, and he, you know, it would have been very easy to say, what am I doing here? You know, but he didn't do that.
Yeah, that's what's amazing in our terms. Think about it. He preached 5 or 6 generations while he built the ark. I don't know how many listened to him,
Right.
let alone heard.
Right. Right.
David, think about this. You know, we read that account there in Genesis. You come there and it talks about Methuselah dying the year of the flood.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been pointed out, we don't know. There may have been righteous people living up to that point. Some people want to say, well, Methuselah died. It doesn't say that. It says he died the year of the flood.
Right.
He may have, the Lord may have spared him there and allowed him to pass before the flood happened to not be put through that judgment, if you will, of what he was putting onto the sinful world at that point.
Right.
So, you know, when we look back there, there's a lot of assumptions a lot of people make that we have to really be careful of. You know, like I said, it's been pointed out, the righteous people there, their lives were taken before that flood happened.
Right. Well, and you know, as time goes on, things get worse and fewer, you know, end up. You know, I've always wondered about Methuselah, but I've always had the thought in my mind that he must have been a good man, and because he wouldn't have been mentioned in the Bible as you know, as being that. And I think I always kind of thought that he probably died the year of the flood, not because of the flood. Other comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 6. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overflow, having made them an example unto those that should live ungodly. So the historical account of this is in Genesis 19, 23 through 29. And it is the third instance of the certainty of God's judgment, the fearful destruction of the city of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, is offered. So this is the third example of destruction that is going to come in kind upon these false teachers. So the prophets cited the destruction which befell those Old Testament cities, and we can read it in several different parts of the Old Testament. This was cited in Isaiah and Ezekiel, and also Jesus talked about it in Luke 17, 28 through 32. And Jude, with more detail than Peter, describes the event, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them having in like manner with these given themselves over to fornication and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the punishment of eternal fire. That's Jude 7. So that's a pretty descriptive example of the things that these false teachers are going to have to look forward to. And it talks here about an overthrow, which these cities suffered as evidence of God's extreme displeasure with their conduct. And it serves as a warning to the destiny that's going to await these ungodly false teachers in the fashion that they have in that time. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 7. And delivered righteous Lot, sore distressed by the lascivious life of the wicked. So the case of Lot is introduced to show that God distinguishes between the righteous and the wicked, and he delivered Lot, and he destroyed all the rest of the people. Of course, it was Lot and his family, and we see here that Lot is referred to as being righteous because he kept himself from the combination of the world that was, that was about him. Was Lot perfect? No, he wasn't perfect. But, he was righteous in the sight of God because he did the things that God wanted him to do in that particular time. Now we see here the word sore distress is translated from the Greek word that means to wear down, to tire out, or to harass beyond endurance. I think that's a really good definition of what went on here. Lot was harassed to the point where it was almost beyond his endurance. And the way that it is written here denotes the distress which Lot felt at the open and the shameless ungodliness which was practiced all around him. There was nowhere that Lot could go to get away from the things that were going on in that day and time. And most of the distress which he felt doubtless came from the ungodly conduct characteristic of his own family. They weren't the shining beacon of righteousness in that situation also. But even all of that, he kept himself away from the things that were going on, even when his own family members mocked him and probably didn't treat him very well. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 8. For that righteous man dwelling among them in seeing and hearing vex his righteous soul from day to day with their lawless deeds. So the text here explains the nature of the distress that Lot felt while he was there in Sodom. And he himself selected the plain of Jordan and the neighborhood of Sodom on the occasion of the dissension between his herdsmen and Abraham. We can read about this in Genesis 13 chapter verses 1 through 13. He picked this place. That he had the choice there, and that's what he picked. And when he made the choice, it was said that men of Sodom were wicked and sinners against Jehovah. And they were exceedingly ungodly people. This is Genesis 13 and 13. And when the consequences of his choices became apparent to him, it appears that he often desired to leave, but he wasn't able to do it. He had to live with the decision that he made. And obviously, in retrospect, I think if he had to do it again, he would have picked someplace else to be. And that's a lesson to us that, before we make a decision, we really need to think the thing out long term and not just look at the short term favor of doing something. So he was forced to live daily in the presence of pretty much gross and unrestrained wickedness. And as a result of that, he was constantly vexed. And the word that was used in the original text means he was kept in constant turmoil, and he was tormented. He was tormented constantly, and his righteous soul, with all this lawlessness that was around him, he like I say, he just couldn't get away from it. And it should be observed that it was Lot who tormented his own soul at what he witnessed. Lot had a conscience, and his conscience was tormented constantly because of the things that he witnessed. It was a little bit past the point of, well, boy, shaking his head, well, that's really a shame that they're doing that. It really bothered him, and there was a deep down pain in his soul because of the things that he was experiencing. And it was just flagrant. They made no attempt to try to hide it. So through the midst of this extreme wickedness, Lot was not corrupted by it. He did not become indifferent to it, and he was daily concerned about it. So this is a good pattern for us today. Number one, we shouldn't be corrupted by it. We shouldn't be indifferent to it. And we need to be concerned about it. And there's a lot of things that's going on today that it does just kind of you've got to be careful not to get indifferent to it because it just goes on constantly and nobody seems to be seems to be doing anything about it. It's easy to get, kind of worn down by the thing. I remember years ago in a sermon, and I can't remember who did the sermon, but the speaker was talking about a triangle, and triangle hitting against a rock, and as it goes around and around, what happens to the point? It just kind of gets worn down and worn down and worn down. And that's kind of the situation, that we want to try to avoid. We need to keep the point sharp and not let it get rounded off and worn down. Comments about that verse? Go ahead, Pete.
Lot had help though. If you go back to the 19th chapter of Genesis and look at what happened, it said while he still lingered. In other words, he was still having trouble. So there were some angels that were sent who actually took him by the hand and his wife and his daughters and led him out of there.
Right.
So it eats away at you.
Right.
We often think Sodom and Gomorrah, their only sin was homosexuality, but Ezekiel actually mentions in Ezekiel 16:49, behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and needy. Thus they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore I removed them from my salt. So we often think the things that Lot was surrounded by was just homosexuality, but Ezekiel said they were just bad people there altogether. They just didn't care about anybody or themselves. It's
Talk to
society
people-
today.
You talk to some people today, and you hear mostly, you don't maybe talk to them, about people in situations in areas, and they say, I can't get out of this, But the story here is, don't conform to that world that you're in.
Right.
You can stay apart and be separate.
Right.
Now, in some situations, they say it's almost impossible to live a godly life. Lot did, in dire circumstances, but now people, like he said, also, Lot had help.
Well, and
Get him out of there.
and we have help today. We've got the Bible to read, and we've got prayer. So I mean, we have the essential things that we need to to help us along the situation also. Hmm? Right. Right. Any other comments about that verse?
We have to remember there, we point out there in Genesis 19, Lot was let out of there. God helped him, let the angels to bring him out. But think about this. We can be as faithful as the day is long. We may have a spouse or children or parents who's like Lot's wife. They were told, don't look back. Why? If you're looking back, means you're longing to go back to that.
Right.
She looked back, just not glancing back to destruction. She looked back and, and it's been heard it brought out. It was more than just glancing back. She was looking at it. The reason she looked back was, it was there was a long, she didn't want to leave what was the life that she had been living
Right.
there. So, you can have a righteous man here, a righteous individual, but their spouse, family, they can be totally opposite from them. You have to continue to march onward, just like Lot did. Have that faith that it doesn't matter what happens to those around you. Keep your eyes on the prize and keep marching forward.
Good point. Other comments about that verse? All right, let's go on to verse 9. The Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptation, and to keep the unrighteousness under punishment unto the day of judgment. So here's the conclusion that's drawn from all these preceding verses, is the Lord can deliver his servants as illustrated by Noah and illustrated by Lot, and he does keep the unrighteousness under punishment, as evidenced in the cases of the angels who sinned, and the wicked, and the other people of the ancient world, and the cities of the plain. So in God's time, when God is ready to do it, he is going to keep and take care of the unrighteousness. And if you think about your life experience and people that you know, and people that were kind of unseemly and always seem to be in trouble, there's a lot of them that come to pretty bad ends. And you have to maybe see a little bit of providence there, that you know, these people, you know, their lives end the way that they do based on the life that they lived. Now, the word here that's tendered as temptation is the same word that is translated trial in 1 Peter 1 and 6, and where it refers to the manifold difficulties which Peter's readers then face. And this passage, therefore, is an assurance of deliverance to the righteous whenever the danger which confronts them. There's a way to be delivered. But you know, one of the things we have to kind of think about is we have to know what the escape is. And that's where, you know, the study and things along that line, and the will to get out of the situation that, you know, that you're in. So the words here, under punishment, are in the original Greek. It means to punish, and reveals that the punishment of the wicked precedes as well as follows the final judgment. So a fact also clearly taught in the narrative of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16:19 through 31, as well as the reference to the angels who sinned that we talked about back in verse 4. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 10. But chiefly them that walk after the flesh in the lust of defilement and despise dominion, daring self-willed, they tremble not to rail at dignities. So chiefly, the word means here, especially those above all other gods will reserve under punishment. So in a parallel passage in Jude, he says, yet in like manner these also in their dreamings defile the flesh and set at naught dominion and rail at dignities. That's verse 8 in Jude. So the false teachers who Peter writes are not only walking after the flesh, they desire the defilement of the flesh which their lusts produce, and they greedily reach forth for the unlawful and polluting use for the flesh which their sin has led them to. You know, they're doing this intentionally. This is not something that is a situation where they are teaching something falsely out of ignorance. They're doing this on purpose. They have a purpose for doing this, and you know, they look for ways to meet the goal that they have to, you know, for the self-promotion and the wealth and things along that line that they're trying to get. So these were evidently guilty of the unspeakable sins and other darker forms of impurity which Paul mentions as prevalent in the Roman Empire, and he talks about this in Romans 1:12 or 24 through 28. And moreover, they despise dominion, like they regard all authority with contempt. They don't want to listen to authority. They want to be an authority unto themselves. And any effort to restrain them in their wicked rebellion, they despise. They don't want to be rebuked. They don't want anybody to try to correct them. As a matter of fact, when somebody does try to correct them, you know, they just pretty much jump all over them in this situation, because that's distracting them from the goal that they're doing. So despite the fact that they knew the penalty for their conduct, they defiled the Lord. They were arrogant, they were proud, and they blasphemed all the dignities and all the authority without fear. They didn't care. They had no respect for authority at all. So these words indicate the extreme coarseness, the insolence, and the hardness of the heart as a characteristic of these false teachers. They had no regard for the things that they were doing, because that was their pretty much their goal.
I think Peter really very emphasizing more spiritual things. You remember first Peter talked about respecting civil authority. Here he is definitely talking about the truth. He's talking about spiritual facts, and the fact that you must respect what has been given, what has been inspired and given.
Right. Other comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 11 real quick here, and we'll probably finish up with this one. Whereas angels, though greater in might and power, bring not a railing judgment against them before the Lord. So the angels, you know, they were greater in every way than these false teachers ever hoped to be, and they did not dare bring any type of railing against the judgment or against God. And they were, you know, they were modest and they restrained in what they did, trying to, do the matters which God had entrusted them to do in a way that God wanted them to do it. So, you know, if the angels knew better than to do something like this, who were in a lot better position than the false teachers there, they had no idea what they were, what they were going to get themselves into because of the things that they did.
That's what he's saying there. You know, he's saying these false teachers, you know, if God didn't spare the angels, he didn't spare the unrighteous in Noah's time, he didn't spare Sodom and Gomorrah, he's not going to spare a false teacher, and your destruction is going to be as bad as these others. And, you know, we need to be careful that we don't fall into that group of false teachers with what we're teaching, preaching, and so on. You know, we can wind up in there as well if we're not careful.
Right. And there's going to be a in my mind, a more severe punishment for the ones who intentionally lead people astray.
So much of what we've been studying today is almost carbon copied in Jude. In Jude 9 reads this: Jude wrote, "But Michael the archangel, when he was speaking with the devil and arguing about the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against him a railing judgment, but said, The Lord rebuke you."
He knew where the authority was. All right, let's stop right here, because when we start with verse 12, we're going to talk about the characteristics and the final destiny of these false teachers. So we've only got about a minute or so, we'll stop here and appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.